Welcome to this explainer. Look, I know exactly why you're here. You want to master this material and totally ace that test. I'm going to be your energetic history teacher for today. And guess what? We are skipping the long, boring introductions, bypassing the fluff, and getting straight into the end-of-course test prep. We've got a ton of ground to cover, so grab your notes, lock in your focus, and let's get to it. We're going to rapid fire through the absolute essentials. We're talking the key people, the critical events, the major causes and consequences, and of course, those landmark Supreme Court cases you actually need to know to pass. I'm going to break it all down so it really sticks in your brain. Section 1, Expansion, Division, and War. Okay, let's dive into this timeline of how America rapidly grew, and then, well, nearly tore itself apart. All right, the driving force of the 1800s? Manifest destiny. It was this widely held belief that the U.S. was literally divinely destined to stretch all the way from the Atlantic to the Pacific. In 1803, Jefferson doubles the country's size with the Louisiana Purchase. Fast forward to 1846, and the U.S. provokes the Mexican-American War to snatch up California in the Southwest. Then, smack in the middle of the Civil War, the government passes the Homestead Act of 1862. This handed out 160 acres of free land to accelerate Western settlement, which is then fully connected by the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869. But, and this is absolutely crucial to remember, this massive, rapid expansion was catastrophic for Native Americans. The federal government broke treaty after treaty, systematically slaughtered the buffalo, and forced Native peoples off their lands through brutal massacres and removals. Now, what's really interesting about this next slide is how two of the most famous abolitionists approached this deeply unpopular movement completely differently. William Lloyd Garrison was a radical white abolitionist who relied heavily on moral persuasion. I mean, the guy literally burned the U.S. Constitution in public, calling it a covenant with death because it protected slavery. Frederick Douglass, on the other hand, well, he actually escaped slavery. He taught himself to read and wrote a first-hand narrative that completely dismantled the pro-slavery myth that Black people were intellectually inferior. Unlike Garrison, Douglass believed political action and the Constitution itself could be weaponized to end slavery. So that intense division over slavery eventually triggers the Civil War. In 1863, Abraham Lincoln delivers the Gettysburg Address. In just 272 words, he brilliantly reframes the whole purpose of the war. It wasn't just about saving the Union anymore. It was about a new birth of freedom. Following the Union victory, we hit the Reconstruction era and get three absolutely critical amendments. The 13th abolished slavery. The 14th guaranteed citizenship and equal protection under the law. And the 15th granted Black men the right to vote. But, tragically, Reconstruction failed. When the federal government pulled troops out of the South in 1877, white supremacist groups like the KKK took over. And these vital amendments gave way to decades of oppressive Jim Crow laws. Moving right along to Section 2, Industry, Immigration, and Reform. We're talking about the Gilded Age. Mark Twain actually coined that term because underneath all the massive industrial growth, there was just staggering inequality and corruption. During this time, a handful of men known as robber barons built massive, sprawling empires in steel, oil, and railroads. So how'd they do it? Let's use a real-world analogy. Say you want to totally dominate the coffee market in your town. If you use vertical integration, like Andrew Carnegie did with steel, you buy the coffee bean farms, the roasting factories, the delivery trucks. Basically, you own the entire supply chain. Now, if you use horizontal integration, like John D. Rockefeller did with Standard Oil, you just buy out every single competing coffee shop until you're the only one left. They also formed trusts to operate as giant monopolies and openly used political bribery to pay off officials, all while their workers suffered in brutal, dangerous 12-hour-a-day conditions. To fight back against all that corruption, we enter the Progressive Era. This was led by investigative journalists called muckrakers who exposed the filth to the public. As your helpful history teacher today, let me give you a massive tip. Matching these muckrakers to their specific reforms is almost a guaranteed point on your EOC test. Upton Sinclair wrote The Jungle, exposing horrific stomach-turning sanitation in meatpacking, which directly led to the Meat Inspection Act. Ida Tarbell wrote a massive expose on Rockefeller's Standard Oil, sparking antitrust enforcement. And Jacob Riis used photography and How the Other Half Lives to show the brutal tenement conditions, which kicked off housing reform. Seriously, burn this table into your memory. So, the crucial point here is understanding how the law was actually applied during this era of massive social change. Here are three foundational 19th century legal landmarks. First up, Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896. This legally justified separate but equal, basically blessing segregation for the next 60 years. Next, Yick Wo v. Hopkins in 1886. This was a massive win for civil rights, establishing that the 14th Amendment's equal protection applies to non-citizens too, after San Francisco tried to discriminate against Chinese laundry owners. Finally, the Dawes Act of 1887. This was essentially a giant land grab that broke up communally held Native American lands in a forced attempt at assimilation, stripping Native peoples of 90 million acres.
All right, Section 3, Global Power in the 20s. We are entering the 20th century now. This is where America really steps out onto the world stage, while at the same time dealing with some really intense cultural clashes back home.
You've probably heard President Theodore Roosevelt's famous quote, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." Well, he sequentially transformed the U.S. into an international police power in 3 main steps. Step 1, the Spanish-American War in 1898 makes the U.S. a true imperial power, snatching up territories like Puerto Rico and Guam. Step 2, the Roosevelt Corollary in 1904 extends the Monroe Doctrine, basically declaring the U.S. an international police power in Latin America. Step 3, he backs a revolution just to build the Panama Canal. When it opens in 1914, it completely transforms global trade and U.S. naval strategy forever. But after World War I, America kind of hits the brakes. President Woodrow Wilson wanted to create a League of Nations for collective security. You know, an attack on one is an attack on all. Think of it like a massive group project to prevent another world war. But the Senate has to approve it. You had the reservationists who were willing to join if they could just tweak it to protect Congress's power to declare war. And then you had the irreconcilables, hardcore isolationists who flatly refused to join, period. Wilson refused to compromise at all. It's like the group leader bailing on their own project. So the Senate rejected the treaty, the U.S. never joined. And without America, the League was completely toothless to stop the rise of Nazi Germany. Back home, the 1920s wasn't just, flappers and jazz. It was an era of intense nativist backlash, reacting against modernization and this huge influx of new immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. We see a massive, terrifying revival of the KKK, which expanded its hatred to immigrants, Catholics, and Jews. There were sundown towns enforcing racial exclusion after dark. The Red Summer of 1919 and the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre saw white mobs violently attack black communities. Congress even passed the severe 1924 Immigration Act, using quotas to heavily restrict who could enter the country. Oh, and the famous Scopes trial? It put a teacher on trial just for teaching evolution, perfectly highlighting the fierce, ongoing clash between traditional religion and modern science. Moving to Section 4, Depression, War, and Fear. The stock market crashes in 1929, ushering in the Great Depression, and that's followed pretty quickly by the intense paranoia of the early Cold War. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's response to the economic collapse was the New Deal. This fundamentally and permanently shifted the federal government's role. For the first time, it took direct responsibility for its citizens' economic security. The FDIC was created to ensure bank deposits, restoring trust so people wouldn't lose their life savings if a bank went under. Alphabet agencies like the CCC and WPA put literally millions of Americans to work building our national infrastructure. And perhaps the biggest one, the Social Security Act of 1935 created a permanent safety net for retirement and unemployment benefits. Let's move on and see how things build following the Allied victory in World War II, because a whole new conflict kicks off with the Soviet Union. Step 1, the Truman Doctrine establishes the overarching policy of containment, basically stopping the spread of communism anywhere it pops up. Step 2, the Marshall Plan uses massive economic aid, we're talking $13 billion, to rebuild Western Europe so those countries wouldn't fall to communism out of pure desperation. Step 3, containment turns hot. The Korean War breaks out when the Communist North invades the South. The U.S. jumps in, leading to a brutal armed conflict that ultimately ends in a stalemate at the 38th parallel. That intense fear of communism spreading globally caused an absolute panic back home, known as the Second Red Scare. You absolutely have to know this vital vocabulary word, McCarthyism. It's the practice of making accusations of treason without any evidence. Senator Joseph McCarthy claimed he had a list of known communists inside the U.S. government. He never actually produced evidence, but his wild, baseless accusations ruined the lives and careers of hundreds of Americans through guilt by association and political witch hunts. His reign of terror really only ended after the televised Army McCarthy hearings finally exposed his bullying tactics to the entire American public. All right, Section 5, Civil Rights to Modernity. We're going to look at the sequential fight for civil rights and then examine some recent landmark shifts in constitutional law. In 1954, Brown v. Board of Education finally overturned separate but equal. But here's the thing. A court ruling wasn't enough to magically end Jim Crow. It took the brilliant escalation of nonviolent direct action, led by figures like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
Notice how each sequential event brilliantly built up public pressure. It started with Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955. Then, college students bravely held lunch counter sit-ins in 1960. In 1961, Freedom Riders faced firebombs just to desegregate interstate buses. By 1963, the brutal police response to peaceful protests in Birmingham was broadcast on national television, totally shocking the nation. This incredible momentum culminated in the massive 1963 March on Washington, which ultimately paved the way for the historic Civil Rights Act of 1964.
As we move into the modern era, our history continues to be shaped by legal precedents. For instance, the late 1990s brought the impeachment of President Bill Clinton. He was impeached by the House for perjury and obstruction of justice, though ultimately acquitted by the Senate. Now, while it was highly partisan, it did set a modern historical precedent for executive accountability. But let's dive into some specific 21st century court and legislative impacts that are super relevant right now. And this next slide brilliantly illustrates how the interpretation of our rights is constantly evolving. Following the tragic events of 9/11, the Patriot Act of 2001 massively expanded government surveillance powers, sparking some intense debates about our Fourth Amendment protections against unreasonable searches. Fast forward to 2022, and the Supreme Court ruled in Dobbs v. Jackson, overturning Roe v. Wade. The court held that the Constitution makes no reference to abortion, thereby returning the authority to regulate it entirely back to individual states. And just recently in 2023, Groff v. DeJoy significantly raised the legal standard for employers, making it much harder for them to deny workplace religious accommodations. These precedents constantly reshape how we interpret privacy, state power, and civil rights today. Section 6, Final EOC Summary Quiz. Take a breath. You've just absorbed a massive amount of history. Now it is time for our exit ticket. Let's do a rapid-fire summary quiz to really lock this into your memory before test day. I'm going to read the prompt, and I want you to shout out the answer. Or, at least say it in your head. Ready? Number 1, the legal doctrine of separate but equal was established by which 1896 court case? That's Plessy v. Ferguson. Number 2, the corrupt practices of Standard Oil were exposed by which famous muckraker? That would be Ida Tarbell. Number 3, FDR's New Deal program that created a permanent retirement and unemployment safety net is called what? Social Security. Excellent work. If you got those, you are locking in the exact right details. So, what does this all mean? How will today's turning points shape the history you live through tomorrow? History isn't just a boring list of dead people and old dates. It's an ongoing, active cycle of reform, reaction, and legal evolution that you are living through right now. The precedents set decades ago affect your life today, and the choices made today will absolutely shape tomorrow. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep reviewing those key cases and concepts, stay locked in, and I'm wishing you the absolute best of luck on your EOC exam. You are totally going to crush it.